The wheel is already spinning when you walk in. Not fast, not screaming, just that low, steady hum of stone cutting air. You smell wet grit before you see it. Iron dust and water mixing into something metallic and sweet, like rain on a train track. In the corner, under a yellow bulb that's been buzzing since 1968, a man leans into a blade the way a priest leans into a prayer. He doesn't look at the edge. He listens. There's this tiny pause, half a heartbeat, before he brings steel to stone. That's the detail nobody writes down. That's the one thing the apprentices always miss. They think grinding is about pressure, about angle, about strength. But the masters from the 1970s? They were waiting for the wheel to breathe. And if you think a grinding wheel doesn't breathe, that's because you've never stood in front of a 7-ton sandstone disc while it spins inches from your ribs. Stone grinding wasn't just friction, it was rhythm. Human precision wrapped around workshop rituals that looked superstitious from the outside. A splash of water at a certain moment, a thumb pressed to the wheel's flank, a fingertip sliding across steel not to feel sharpness, but temperature. Back then, before industrial consolidation folded small workshops into faceless plants, before synthetic grinding stones arrived in perfect sterile crates, this was a conversation between man and rock. And if you leaned in close enough, you could hear it. Most people think blades are made in the forge. Fire, sparks, hammers ringing like church bells. That's the romantic lie. The forge gives you potential. The grinding wheel decides if that potential survives. In the 1970s, in towns where grinding sheds lined rivers that once powered them, masters risked everything on stone that could betray them in a second. These wheels were carved from sandstone blocks hauled from quarries generations earlier. Each one weighed as much as a truck. 7 tons of layered sediment spinning at lethal speed. And here's the truth they never told the inspectors. Every single wheel had a mood. You'd arrive before dawn. The workshop would still be cold. The stone held the night inside it. First touch of the day, you didn't grind. You placed your palm flat against its face. You felt for vibration, for wobble, for a tremor that said something inside had shifted. A misaligned grinding wheel didn't warn you with a polite sound. It whispered through your bones. The old masters called it the drift. The drift wasn't something you could measure with a dial. It was a feeling, a shadow in the rim, a faint shimmy that only showed up if you'd spent half your life staring at a spinning stone. The masters would lean back, squint with one eye, and let the wheel blur into a gray halo. If the halo looked thick on one side, thin on the other, they knew something was off. They'd reach for a wooden mallet. Nothing dramatic, nothing heavy. Just enough weight to persuade, not punish. 1 tap to the housing, maybe 2. Then they'd wait again, always that pause, because 1 tap too many, and you'd shift the balance past recovery. 1 tap too soft, and you'd trust a lie. Human precision wasn't about perfection. It was about correction, continuous, quiet correction. A wrist turning half a degree, a stance widening by an inch, an elbow floating instead of locking. Grinding wasn't brute force. It was a negotiation, and the negotiation never stopped. Water trickled from a tin pipe above the wheel, not flooding it, just kissing the surface. Too much water and you'd glaze the stone. Too little, and you'd burn the steel. The masters controlled the flow with a bent nail wedged into a rubber hose. That was the valve. Not a digital controller, not a sensor, a nail. Workshop rituals grew around these details. Before the first blade touched stone, some men would spit lightly into the trough, watching how the saliva rippled. If it drifted left, they adjusted their stance. If it circled back, they checked the spindle. Superstition? Maybe. Or maybe it was a low-tech way of reading microcurrents in the water flow. From the outside, it looked primitive. From the inside, it was alive. Then industrial consolidation started tightening its grip. Small family grinding shops were folded into centralized plants. Efficiency experts walked in with clipboards and walked out with budgets slashed. Production quotas replaced intuition. Time studies replaced morning rituals. Synthetic grinding stones began arriving in wooden crates stamped with serial numbers, perfectly balanced. Uniform density. Factory tested. They didn't have moods. They didn't drift in the same unpredictable way. They were engineered to remove variability. On paper, that was progress. But natural sandstone had pores, tiny irregular cavities formed over millions of years. As steel kissed stone, those pores released grit in uneven bursts. The cut wasn't mathematically smooth. It was organic, alive. The master had to ride it, compensate for it, guide the blade like steering through shifting sand under shallow water. Synthetic stones didn't breathe like that. Their grit distribution was controlled, predictable, repeatable, and something delicate began to thin. It's like watching fog lift off a river at dawn. You don't see it vanish. You just look up one morning and realize the water feels naked. The masters felt the change before anyone else did. Orders increased. Speed mattered more than touch. Apprentices were trained to hit numbers, not to feel vibration. The half-beat pause, the listening, started looking like wasted seconds. One supervisor reportedly told a grinder, "We don't pay for feelings." That sentence cut deeper than any blade. Because feelings were the warning system. A 7-ton sandstone wheel spinning at full speed stores energy like a coiled storm. If it's perfectly aligned, it hums steady. If it's off by a hair, centrifugal force begins to tear at the weakest seam. Microfractures inside the stone start racing outward with every revolution. You won't hear them crack. You'll only feel a slight tremor under your fingertips, if you're paying attention. That was the pivot point creeping closer. There was a day in the late 1970s when a master saw the halo thicken on one side. Barely noticeable. Production was behind. A manager stood near the doorway, arms crossed. The grinder felt the drift. He knew the wheel needed time, but time was expensive now. He adjusted his stance instead, shifted his wrist angle, tried to grind around the flaw. That's what human precision does. It adapts. It compensates. But physics doesn't negotiate. When a grinding wheel is misaligned, the imbalance multiplies with speed. Stress concentrates along invisible fault lines. At a few hundred revolutions per minute, those fault lines become racing cracks. And when a 7-ton sandstone wheel lets go, it doesn't crumble gently. It explodes. Not with fire, but with stone. Chunks the size of bricks tear through timber walls. Water troughs flip. Steel racks twist. The air turns white with dust so thick you can't see your own hands. The hum becomes a roar, and then nothing. In seconds, decades of workshop rituals are erased. After that, insurance companies didn't argue. Inspectors didn't hesitate. Factory owners looked at natural stone and saw liability. Synthetic grinding stones, with controlled stress tolerances and predictable failure modes, suddenly looked like salvation. The narrative shifted overnight. The old masters weren't guardians of precision anymore. They were risks. And here's the part that haunts me. The wheel didn't fail because it was primitive. It failed because the half-beat pause was rushed. If the grinder had been given the morning to realign, to reset, to listen, maybe the microfractures would have been caught. Maybe the drift would have been corrected, or maybe not. But once the explosion happened, trust between man and stone cracked wider than the wheel ever did. Listening began to look like superstition. And when listening looks foolish, it disappears fast. Out back of one of those factories, long after the upgrade to synthetic systems, a 7-ton sandstone wheel was left upright against a brick wall, too heavy to move cheaply, too dangerous to reuse, too inconvenient to destroy. Rain carved dark streaks down its face. Moss crept into its pores. Kids tapped it with sticks and laughed at the dull, ancient thud. It stands there like a fossil of human precision, a monument nobody meant to build. And if you stare at it long enough, you start to wonder whether the real danger wasn't the stone. It was forgetting how to listen to it. By the early 1980s, the sound inside grinding workshops had changed. It was still loud, still filled with friction and water and steel. But the rhythm was different, cleaner, straighter, predictable in a way that felt almost sterile. Synthetic grinding stones didn't hum with the same uneven breath. They produced a flat, continuous tone. No wavering, no personality. For the factory owners, this was a victory. For the old masters, it was like listening to a voice with no emotion. They adapted because they had to. Hands that once floated freely now worked within tighter tolerances. Movements became smaller, safer, less intuitive. Instead of reading vibration through bone and skin, grinders were taught to watch gauges, measure wear patterns, follow replacement intervals printed in manuals, written by engineers who had never leaned their chest inches from 7 tons of spinning earth. The craft didn't die in a dramatic collapse. It was slowly starved. Like a river redirected through concrete channels, it still flowed, but its wild edges were gone. The apprentices coming into workshops during this time never saw the morning rituals. They never saw a master rest his palm against a cold sandstone wheel and close his eyes like he was listening for a heartbeat. They never saw the tiny corrections, the quiet negotiations between human and stone. They learned consistency, They learned safety. They learned to trust the machine. And trust in this new world moved in only one direction. The synthetic wheels were made from engineered abrasives, bonded under controlled conditions, every pore placed with intention, every rotation predictable. When they wore down evenly. When they failed, they cracked along expected lines. They didn't surprise you. That was the point. But surprise had been part of the old language. Natural sandstone wheels aged like living things. Every blade that touched them changed them slightly. Every correction, every vibration, every tiny imbalance added history to their surface. A master wasn't just grinding steel. He was shaping the wheel itself over time, creating a relationship that deepened with every passing year. It's like the difference between walking a familiar dirt path and walking a factory floor. One remembers you, the other doesn't. There's something else most people never realized. Natural sandstone wheels taught restraint. If you pushed too hard, they punished you immediately. Heat built fast, steel discolored, edges warped. The wheel forced you to respect limits. It demanded patience. Synthetic stones, stronger and more uniform, tolerated more aggression. They allowed speed. Speed became the new religion. Production numbers climbed. Output charts improved. Blades rolled off lines with identical geometry, identical finishes, identical edges. From a quality control standpoint, it was perfection. But perfection has a strange side effect. It erases fingerprints. Blades ground on natural sandstone carried subtle variations. Not flaws, signatures. Tiny asymmetries born from human correction. Those asymmetries made each blade respond differently in the hand. Some felt eager, some felt steady, some felt almost aware of their own balance. You couldn't measure it easily, but you could feel it. The old masters noticed it first when they picked up blades ground entirely on synthetic systems. They'd run a thumb lightly along the spine, flex the blade in their grip, tilt it under the light. Everything was right, and yet something was missing. It's like hearing a song played perfectly by a machine, every note in place, every beat exact, but none of the tension that makes your chest tighten without knowing why. Human precision had been replaced by engineered certainty, and certainty doesn't require listening. One by one, the rituals disappeared. The bent nail water valves were replaced with regulated flow systems. The wooden mallets were retired. The habit of watching the blur of the spinning rim gave way to scheduled maintenance checks. Palm tests became safety violations. Even the posture changed. Masters used to lean into the wheel with their whole body, balanced but intimate. The new grinders stood back more, separated by guards and shields. Safer, yes, but distant. It was like watching two old friends stop talking, even while standing in the same room. Out back, that abandoned 7-ton sandstone wheel remained. Rain soaked into its pores, then froze in winter, expanding, opening microscopic cracks. Moss spread slowly across its surface, feeding on moisture trapped inside sediment millions of years old. The wheel was returning to stillness, to the quiet state it had held before humans ever forced it to spin. Nature was reclaiming its breath. Sometimes, former grinders would visit it. Not officially. Just passing by, hands in pockets, they'd stop without saying anything, maybe touch the surface lightly, maybe not. There was no ritual left to perform, only memory. Because the truth is, stone grinding had never just been about shaping steel. It was about shaping attention. It trained men to notice things most people never see. The faint tremor in a spinning mass. The temperature shift in a blade before discoloration appeared. The difference between a true rotation and a lie. It gave them a way of knowing that didn't depend on instruments, and that way of knowing didn't transfer to synthetic systems. When the need to listen disappeared, the listening itself faded. It's like losing the ability to navigate by stars because streetlights are always on. The sky is still there. But the skill becomes invisible, useless, forgotten. By the late 1980s, an entire generation entered grinding workshops without ever touching natural sandstone. They learned faster, worked safer, produced more. And yet, they inherited only the outcome of the craft, not its conversation. The abandoned wheel behind the factory stood as proof of that break. 7 tons of silent sediment that had once required constant negotiation, constant humility, constant attention. Now it required nothing, no listening, no correction, no pause, just abandonment. And maybe that's the strangest part. The wheel hadn't lost its ability to teach. We had lost the willingness to learn from it. Years later, when the factory itself shut down, the wheel was still there. The brick walls had cracked. Windows were broken, teeth knocked out by time. Wind moved through empty rooms that once held the steady hum of production. But out back, leaning exactly where it had been left decades earlier, the sandstone wheel remained. 7 tons of stillness. Rain had hollowed shallow grooves down its face. Moss filled the pores that once released grinding grit. The spindle hole at its center, once perfectly fitted to a steel shaft, was now just an empty eye staring at nothing. It hadn't moved in nearly half a century, and yet it didn't feel dead, because sandstone doesn't forget motion easily. Every revolution it had ever made was written into its structure. Every vibration, every correction, every moment, a master had leaned in and waited for that half-beat pause. It was all still there, fossilized in silence. Most people walking past would never know what they were seeing. Just obsolete equipment, a heavy inconvenience someone never bothered to remove. But if you placed your palm against its surface, something strange happened. Not physically, not visibly, mentally. Your mind would try to imagine it spinning again, try to reconstruct the hum, try to hear the sound of water kissing the rim, try to feel the invisible tension that once lived inside it. And in that moment, you'd realize the wheel was never just a tool. It was a teacher. The grinding masters of the 1970s didn't trust the wheel because it was safe. They trusted it because it forced them to pay attention. It demanded presence. It punished arrogance. It rewarded humility. It was like standing next to a wild animal that tolerated you, but never belonged to you. Synthetic grinding stones changed that relationship forever. They removed the unpredictability, removed the drift, removed the microfractures that whispered warnings. They turned grinding into a controlled transaction instead of a negotiation, safer, faster, scalable. And in doing so, they removed the need for the half-beat pause, that tiny moment of listening, the pivot point. The explosion that shattered trust in natural stone did more than destroy a wheel. It gave factories permission to stop teaching intuition, to replace listening with compliance, to trade human precision for mechanical certainty. From a business standpoint, it made perfect sense. From a human standpoint, something irreplaceable slipped away, because intuition is like a muscle that only exists while you use it. Once you stop, it doesn't scream, it doesn't protest, it just fades quietly, like breath on cold air. The last generation of true sandstone grinding masters retired without ceremony. No announcements, no monuments. Their hands, once steady against spinning earth, grew still. Their knowledge wasn't written down, not because they were secretive, but because it couldn't be. You can't write down the exact pressure of a fingertip sensing drift. You can't diagram the moment when a hum turns from truth into warning. You can't quantify the half-beat pause. That knowledge lived in bodies, not books. And bodies don't last forever. The abandoned wheel behind the factory still stands, but it's changing. Winter freezes widen its cracks. Summer heat dries its core. Rain continues its slow, patient work. The same natural forces that formed it millions of years ago are now unmaking it grain by grain. It's returning to dust, like the craft it once served. Stone grinding, as it existed then, is like the last ember of a fire left in an empty room. It doesn't vanish all at once. It dims, softly, inevitably, until there's nothing left to glow. Modern blades are better in measurable ways, more consistent, more accessible, more predictable. But they are born in systems that never had to listen to stone breathe. And that changes the relationship between human and tool. Because when you remove risk entirely, you also remove the need for trust, and trust was the hidden core of the craft. Trust that the wheel would hold together. Trust that your senses would warn you in time. Trust that the half-beat pause meant something real. That abandoned 7-ton sandstone wheel is still out there somewhere, leaning into brick, holding the ghost of every blade it ever shaped. It no longer hums, no longer spins, no longer teaches. It just waits. Not for someone to use it again, but as a reminder of the moment when human precision stopped listening, and the stone, for the first time in millions of years, was finally allowed to rest.